expecting. So the idea is this: really, what I want to do is not what people typically try to do, which is you offer a particular topic or a particular question, and then you offer a solution. Rather, to use the topic as conversation, and then to pull out a particular teaching from somewhere in the Torah that is related to the topic, and then the challenge is to try and actually, take the solution out of the so topic. What's playing on my mind, and what do you think, or what do you feel? Because I want to talk today a little bit about how the rate of change in society and how we deal with it as parents, and how I think the biggest question is, how do you still stand firm on good old-fashioned values in a world that is so rapidly changing? So my question to you is, what are you finding? Like, what are the shifts that are happening around you that you feel are uncharted territory, or nobody ever told us what we're supposed to do over here, or this really challenges things that I took for granted as a value set? So let's start with that, and let's kind of paint the picture of where we are and what we're dealing with, and then we can see, and like I say, there's not going to be some kind of quick fix solution and do these 3 things and your children will be okay. But rather to get a headspace, to create a mindset that is aligned with Judaism and aligned with Torah values, and how Torah values could be relevant in a very, very rapidly changing world. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to talk about today morning. Okay, so yeah, what's I don't know, what's out there? What's happening?
Technology issues.
Yeah, I was just going to say technology and social media is the obvious.
Okay, now there's 2 very different things. There's technology and there's social media. Now, although social media is run on technology, I don't think that social media and technology present the same challenges.
Except that I think that
Basically, the principle is any form of interaction with technology means that we're going to talk about our kids over here, although it applies equally to adults. But I'll tell you why it's relevant to distinguish between kids and adults, because they never had the alternative.
Yeah.
We did have the alternative.
and that's
right?
uncharted territory for us.
Correct. So when you're interacting with something or someone via a device, it's obviously a very different kind of an experience and relationship to when you're dealing with people face to face. And do you know how to, I always joke that when we were kids and we came from South Africa where we had like this whole educational system, this whole secular education, and we met other kids from New York who had never studied any secular at all. So we used to joke about how they would talk about, you've got to plug it out. You know, plug it out, because that's the natural opposite of plug it in, right? So the kids don't know how to plug it out. That's the thing. They don't know how to plug it out.
They also see that parents often don't. Also.
Of course.
Exactly.
Of course. We're not modeling to our kids the behavior we're expecting from them, necessarily. Now, there's another point I think that's very important, which is a little bit more on the social media side than on the tech side. So what you're saying about technology generally is that it interferes with the ordinary means of connection between people, and that's a big problem, and it's certainly a big problem. The social media side adds something to that, which is the dopamine rush. So you don't get likes from your family like you get from your followers on social media. So it's not just a matter of being able to unplug, but it's also a matter of being able to feel that there's value and even that I'm kind of liked by the people in my family, or made to feel good about the interaction I have with family or with friends or whatever the case, as I have, the quick fix on technology. So I think that's maybe a little bit more the social media element. Because anything else about tech that you think comes into this conversation?
Yeah, like the likes and the happiness, but also the looking at everyone else and their life looks so
Correct.
good, and then you think, well, I don't have that, I'm not doing that, I'm not a grass.
Okay, so there's the social media, that's again specific to social media as opposed to technology generally, is that social media produces this ongoing sense of envy. That
Comparison is always you can't.
Right.
Yeah.
So because you're constantly comparing, you're constantly feeling your own lack
Yeah.
or your own inadequacies. And that's a really big deal, because then you've got to fill that void, and it becomes really difficult to fill the void, and perhaps you think less of your parents because they can't supply all the things that everybody else has. I'm sure that I've told the story before, but when was it? Not this past December, the December before. So everybody was just kind of coming out of that massive 2021 lockdown experience, and we're talking about actually going away and actually engaging with people. So I went into my front garden. I don't have the fanciest garden around, but we've got this one tall, thin palm tree. I don't know what kind of a palm it is, that very thin kind of thing. And it was an absolutely bright blue day, so I took a picture at an angle where all you saw was this bright blue sky and then this palm. And I posted it on social media and I said, guess where I am? So, and then obviously my follow-up was X amount of hours later, we know people were trying to guess, you're here, there. So then I followed up to say, no, actually, I'm at home and just don't do this to everybody else over December. That was the message. Because there's the other side of it. Not only is there the sense of we're missing out and they have something, but then you start to have to project things that are not necessarily reality to give the impression that you're okay. So you start, obviously what you put onto social media are always going to be the best pictures and so on and so forth. Okay, so far what we've said is technology and social media are huge challenges, uncharted territory, and we don't know how we're supposed to deal with this as parents effectively. And dare I say, I'm giving this my own addition, we can't really keep up because it's happening too quickly. Okay, anything else in the tech space?
Well, by extension,
Specifically.
it affects your identity. I think kids are also, especially teenagers in general, battle with who they are.
Yeah.
And I think it's just exacerbated in today's times because they get a sense of who they should be and who they are and who everybody else is, not from real stuff.
Right. So they got to this false sense of their own identity and false sense of what they should be and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about that, by the way, interesting but scary, is the rocketing levels of teenage depression and worse.
Yes.
Right? Very, very scary stuff. Very scary stuff. So I think there's another side of tech as well, which perhaps is so fresh that we haven't yet really started to even talk about it, let alone unpack it, and that's AI. Because that is going to challenge our kids in ways that we can never begin to imagine. So for example, I'll just use one example, which is that traditionally we always tell our children it's really important to do well at school. That doesn't mean that they have to do better than they're capable of, but we definitely expect that our kids should do to the best of their abilities at school. That's what we expect, and it's a fair expectation. Now, every one of us, and I suppose I'm a little bit more in this game than most, maybe Miriam's a second, the more kids you have, the more diversity of excuses not to do schoolwork you get. So I've had my kids turn around to me and say, and I'm sure you have as well, what's the point? What's the point of school? And when my older kids were younger, it was easier to respond than it is to my young kids now. What's the point of school? So like my kids, when they were young, used to say, why do we have to study maths? We'll just use a calculator. Now the kids are saying, why do we have to learn how to write? AI is going to write for us. And they don't just mean, even if they don't understand it yet, they don't necessarily just mean writing essays or compositions. But the rate at which things are going to go in the AI world will bring a whole different challenge to us, which is how do we even advise our kids what they should study after school? Because which of those jobs will be relevant by the time they finish varsity? So we're living in really uncharted territory over here. So that's a massive factor. As a parent, how do I know how to speak to my child and be relevant where it's quite likely that the world I'm talking about is not going to be the world they live in? And the rate of that change is going to be so rapid and so extreme that we're going to be completely out of our depth. And then what do we tell them? So what do we give our kids? What do we do with our kids? Okay, so that's all under the technology umbrella, but I don't think technology is the only area of challenge. What else are we contending with as modern parents? Dealing with stuff we didn't have to deal with when we were younger.
The LGBT.
Exactly. So identity stuff. So identity stuff, but not identity stuff in the sense of, am I popular, am I recognized, do I have a value? Identity stuff as into the core of your identity. So what are you? What are you? Does biology even count anymore? These kinds of things. How do we talk about these things with the kids? How do you even get your head around it? I had a teenager this week, this Shabbos come over to me and say, I really need to come and speak to you because I don't know how to relate to the kids in my class who have gender fluidity.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it. And I'm thinking, maybe find another rabbi. I don't know how to do it either. Like, what am I supposed to advise you? And it's such a minefield because anything that you say that doesn't fit the narrative is automatically some kind of, caveman mentality. So that's another layer of challenge. Not only how do you discuss it without being turned into a troglodyte because who are you and where do you come from, you backward person. So everything's been turned 180 degrees. Now what? How do you navigate this? And the objective over here is not to dig our heels in and say everybody's crazy except us, because that's not helpful. So there's got to be a way, to work through it. So I think that's part of the danger and the perhaps the unfairness of the whole thing, is that you're dealing with people realistically, scientifically, who are not yet fully developed neurologically. And we're giving them all of this confusion and encouraging them in particular directions and expecting them to wade their way through it. So that's a really big deal. And then, of course, there's the classics, which are never going to go away. The classics are, who says I have to do what you do? So those classics are always going to be there, right? The classics of just because, and everybody has their level, right? So one person has the level of being absolutely from whatever that means, and somebody else has the level where we are together as a family every single Friday night, and somebody else has a level whereby we only eat certain foods and we don't eat other foods. So then we also have all of that stuff, like the good old classics that come around of the children questioning and challenging that. And why do I have to be like you? What is it? How they dress. That's a big thing. Why is my mother so restrictive? And look how everybody else dresses. Of course, the kids will always use the everybody else argument, right? Everybody else is allowed to. Nobody else has to stay home. Nobody else has a curfew. Everybody else has a phone. Nobody else has a filter. All that kind of stuff. So there's quite a lot of stuff that we've got to wade through. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is when there are many, many targets, which is exactly where we are as parents, there are many, many issues on the table, we as parents are going to be overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of what we're dealing with. So I have a theory that one of the primary reasons that people in today's world are so incredibly stressed and anxious is not because life in today's world is worse than it's ever been in history. To the contrary, life is better than it's ever been in history, and that's why we're so stressed and anxious, because life is so good. Why? I'll tell you simply, and really we don't have to go back into the Middle Ages or something like that. Let's go back to when we were kids, because that's much more relatable than if I tell you your great-grandparents in the shtetl. Let's talk about us as kids. You came home on an average day in primary school. Let's level it at that level. You came home on an average day from primary school, whatever time school finished, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, whichever school you went to. What choices did you now have for how you were going to spend the rest of your day? What were your choices?
Play outside.
Right?
Do your homework.
Swim.
Ride a bike.
Right?
Or wait till 5 o'clock
when the test pattern came on. Okay, so the point I'm making is that life then wasn't as good technically as it is now, because we have so much more now. It was certainly a lot simpler. So you didn't have that anxiety of, well, what happens if, for example, before I ask the question, what do our kids have? What are their choices when they come home at whatever time it is they come home? What are their choices?
Those little rectangular things that they hold in their hands 24 hours.
Yeah, so those devices. Now, but hang on a second. Let's drill down into that. So what are their choices? Their choices aren't, am I going to flip to channel 1 or channel 2 on a smaller version of the TV that we used to have as kids? That's not how it works, right? So what is it? My choices are
WhatsApp, Snapchat, TikTok.
Now, every single one of those comes, so I've got a whole string of choices, right? Is it going to be this social media or that social media? It's going to be WhatsApp, whatever the case is. Every single one of those comes with a whole string of sub-choices. So am I going to see this person's content that they posted? Am I going to post? If I'm going to post, what am I going to post? How am I going to be relevant that somebody else is going to actually appreciate my post? I'm going to get feedback either online now or tomorrow morning when I go to school, and everybody's going to say, that video that you posted on TikTok was unbelievable. And do you see the reaction that you got, and whatever the case is? And is somebody going to respond after they blue check my message on WhatsApp? Are they going to respond? Are they going to ignore me? Are they going to ghost me? So in a simple afternoon, the array of choices that these kids have eclipses the choices that we had in a whole term of school. That's where the stress is coming from. And we as parents are the same. We also have equivalent stresses because maybe we're not onto TikTok, but we still feel that WhatsApp pressure. Absolutely. This person's message, oh my gosh, I got so many messages. I got to deal with them because otherwise there's going to be more messages. And then when the person sees, have you ever inadvertently opened a message that you didn't intend to make? Oh, now the stress goes through the roof because now I've opened the message. They're going to see that I've opened the message and then I'm not responding to the message. I haven't thought about the response. That's why I didn't want to open the message because I haven't yet thought about the response. And now there's this pressure, right? So we've got this immense amount of stress going on in our heads. The stress is not because life is difficult. The stress is because life is complex. There's so much stuff. So it's the same thing. What were the big issues that we were dealing with as kids when we were kids? What were the big issues we were dealing with? Are you going to pass the year or not? You know what? I remember as a kid, what kind of a suit were you going to get for your bar mitzvah? It was like a big thing because you got a suit for your bar mitzvah. Not like our kids, like every Montek and Donishik, they're going out and having a whole freak out. Did I get the right brand name tackies? Because maybe by the time I get them, no one else in school's wearing them anymore. So we've got this mass of stuff going on in their minds and going on in our minds, and it's for that reason I don't think we even know how to start the conversation to get anywhere in any of this because we're feeling completely overwhelmed. That's one thing that we share with our children is this overriding sense of being overwhelmed. And we are overwhelmed. It's an incredible thing. That's why we're so on edge. That's why we get, I'm driving, what do you think? I didn't get messages before this. Are you recording? Why? Because I wanted to be there, but I can't be there, so you're going to record. Because if you don't record, maybe I'll never know this information. I'll never know how to deal with my kids. Because and then you feel guilty. I wasn't able to get to the rabbi. I see my message. I don't know if you saw my message. You didn't blue check. So I don't know if he's going to record. So this is how we're living. We've got so much noise in our heads that I actually think, and this is really the purpose of what I would like to do with these shiurim, with this series, is one by one, visit principles, like a single principle at a time. Is this principle going to resolve all of our issues? There are no guarantees. But if we can start to focus, to home in on a principle at a time, and just understand how we're supposed to think step by step, issue by issue. And when I say issue by issue, I don't mean we're going to address issue A and use this particular thinking, but rather just to try and get some collective thought processes that are going to be helpful for us one at a time. And sometimes that means to consolidate the same thinking again and again in different ways using different models in Judaism. Hopefully that will help us. So anybody who thinks that this is a 6-week course and you come out on the other end and now you know how to deal with your kids, it's not going to be that way at all. This is trying to alter our entire perspective and approach to life, which is long, hard work, but it's hopefully worthwhile in the long run. So each time what I'd like to try to do is pull out something either from the Torah portion that we're learning or a Yom Tov that's coming up or something else that's going on in the spiritual world and say, okay, so what can we learn from this particular thing? And initially, when we visit each one, you might say, what's it got to do with anything? I've got a problem right now with my kid because of X and Y, and you're telling me a story that happened 3,000 years ago, like Kesher, what's the connection? So that's the point of it. I want to try and pull on these things because this is who we are. This is where our wisdom lies. This is the stuff we're supposed to mine for value, is the stuff that's in the Torah. If we can't look inside our own Torah for this wisdom, then we're lost before we start. So today, let's pull one story out of the Torah portion, the parasha that's coming up this Shabbos, a story that initially is going to have absolutely nothing, I'm sure you're going to feel, has absolutely nothing to do with anything you care about. Okay, that's not entirely true. There is something about it that all of us cares about. But we'll just unpack the story. Okay, so the parasha this week is Beshalach. Every parasha tends to have one main anchor story or anchor theme that represents the whole parasha. Does anybody know what the anchor story is of this week's parasha?
Are we carrying on with the plagues?
So last week we finished the plagues and we got out of Egypt. That's a big hint. So now we're out of Egypt.
So it must be the gold calf.
No, we're not at the golden calf yet.
Sorry, what's
The rock and the water is coming, but it's not this is not the big rock and water story. There we go. It's the splitting of the sea. That's the story of this week's parasha. That's the big anchor story, is the splitting of the sea. Not the splitting migraine that you have at the end of every day. It's the splitting of the sea. Now, the symbolism of the splitting of the sea is, and why it's relevant to our conversation, is because when you stand at the beach, you have no idea what's in the water. I don't know if you've seen those aerial drone videos of the sharks, right? So suddenly it's better not to know what's in the water. So when you're standing there, you can't see what's beneath the surface. So the splitting of the sea means to open up and expose things that you never saw before. That's why it's quite an insightful parasha, and it's got a lot of stuff. But ironically, we're not actually going to look at that. We're going to go one step past that. The Jews are now on the other side of the sea, whatever the other side means. I'm not going to get into the debate whether they crossed over, or as the Talmud implies that they actually did a semicircle and they came out further down, but on the same side. I'm just saying, when they get to the other side, nobody knows that part of the story. Everybody knows the part of the story where they go into the sea and it's very scary and overwhelming and the sea splits and it's wonderful and the Egyptians are killed. Nobody knows the story of what happens on the other side. So that's where we're going to start. If you're a Jewish person who's just been saved in the most supernatural, mind-blowing way, what would you do next? It's a surprisingly simple answer, actually.
Thank you.
Exactly. You'd be grateful. You'd show gratitude. And that's what the Torah says, that they came out on the other side and they sang the song, which becomes known as Az Yashir, which is this great song of gratitude to Hashem, which is obviously well placed. It makes sense. That's what you do. Where was their next destination? So they've left Egypt. It's a journey. They've left Egypt. They've crossed the sea. Where's the next destination?
And they travel for 40 years.
Before the 40 years. The 40 years hasn't happened yet. At this point, they're supposed to get to Israel soon. What?
Wasn't it Mara by the rock?
So Mara is right there. It's not a destination. It's a waypoint. It's not a destination. So what's their next destination? Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
To receive the Torah. Okay? So let's create the journey. The Jews have left Egypt, which is a massive miracle. They're feeling extremely grateful that happened. They've gone through the splitting of the sea, which is an equal, if not greater, miracle. They're very grateful for that it happened. And the next part of their journey is to take them to Mount Sinai, where they will receive the Torah. They don't know what that means, but they know it's something positive. How do I know that they felt that was something positive? Because what did they do on their way to Sinai? They complained everywhere. But what did they do on their way to Sinai? Exactly. What did they do on the way to Sinai? They counted the days. You only count the days if you're looking forward to something, if you're anticipating something, right? So they counted the days. So let's get into their heads and think about what's their mindset at this point in time. They've come out of the splitting of the sea. They're on their way to Sinai. They're counting the days. What kind of headspace are they in? Positive, optimistic, excited, moving in a healthy direction, appreciating the blessings in their lives. Everything's good. And not only is everything good, which often is the beginning of the end, but because when everything's good, that's when people have issues, or what we call in today's world, first world problems. But the point is, they have somewhere meaningful to head. And that's empowering for them. And that's uplifting for them. So they're headed in a really positive direction. So here's the part of the story nobody knows. And it's written directly in the Torah, and nobody knows it. Moshe has to drag the Jews from the seaside to get back on their journey to go to Mount Sinai. Now why? Why does he have to drag them? The whole purpose of leaving Egypt was to get to Sinai. Even the promised land was only a secondary objective. The primary objective of getting out of Egypt was to go to Mount Sinai. They felt this was so important, they're counting the days. Counting the days means they're enthusiastic. When your kids are counting the sleeps to something, do you have to drag them to that thing? There's an amazingly disparate reality between the child who has to get up for school in the morning at a decent hour to the child who has to get up at 3 a.m. to get in the car to drive for who knows how many hours to some holiday destination. Because when you look forward to something, you don't need too much encouragement. Why is Moshe dragging them from the sea towards the mountain? What happened? Why is he dragging them?
Maybe they were scared.
What would they be scared of?
This omnipotent power that they've seen.
So maybe they're scared of what that's going to entail, the responsibilities,
Maybe
what
fear
he,
of the unknown.
fear of the unknown. Okay, fear of the unknown. Remember, leaving Egypt was fear of the unknown for them, big time. Walking into the water, because remember, it only split after they started to walk into the water, was fear of the unknown, big time. By now, they should have made some progress.
They were just having fun.
Oh, okay, so they were just having fun. Okay, let's talk about it. So in your mind right now, they're all at the beach.
Yeah, exactly.
Chill.
They're at the beach. What do you want from them? They're at the beach. You've got to go schlep them off into the desert to go stand on a mountain and receive the Torah. 5 more minutes, Dad. 5 more minutes.
Maybe they were, maybe it's enough. Maybe they've had all of these experiences and it's just, like, this is all they can manage and it's enough.
Okay, so they need a bit of downtime. They're overstimulated. Overstimulated, like our kids, right? So they're overstimulated. Well, guess what? Guess what the Talmud says? So there's one part of the story that we don't think about. In those days, in ancient civilizations, the military was the pride of the civilization. So now think back to everything you've ever learned in history or any of the illustrations you've ever seen in any of the books of the Romans, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, whoever it was. Their war machinery was the pride of their society, and so they always invested a lot in the appearance of their army. So they always had these very ornate chariots and body armor, and their swords had jewels in the swords, that kind of thing.
Korea these days.
Yes, exactly. Or Iran, for that matter. It's the same principle. So there's a tremendous amount of wealth that the Egyptian army carries with them as they go into war. So now you've got the Egyptian army chasing the Jewish people. That means they're coming laden with these bejeweled swords and these golden chariots.
So we want that now.
And now all the stuff washes up on the seashore. Everybody's taking what they can find. So Moshe's got to drag them off to Mount Sinai because they're busy filling their pockets with the wealth of the Egyptian army. Okay? Is that a plausible story? Yeah? You happy with that? You're happy with that? So let's just put this into context. This is where we're on the road trip with our kids, but we had to stop to fill up the car, and naturally everybody had to go to the bathroom. And now your kid is standing there arguing that they need one of these bags of sweets at the quick shop, and you're trying to tell them, but we're going somewhere better than the bag of sweets. That's basically what's happening here, right? So we're on the way to Sinai, and we can't get the people to follow because they got fixated on well, in those days it was a bejeweled sword, and today is a device. So there you are, the kid is glued to the device. How do you get them to move? How do you shift them along? That's Moshe's problem right now. He says, I know that you know that there's value in the journey and the destination, and yet you're so caught up in the momentary satisfaction of what you're dealing with. So now how are we going to move you along? Okay, that's the story, and it completely resonates, right? So now you can re-envisage yourself every single time you're fighting with your kids. See yourself as Moshe with his staff at the edge of the sea, trying to pry the Israelites off a rock. And maybe it's not so upsetting anymore to have these fights, because like I'm the Moses in the story, and you are the complaining Israelites. There's a problem with this. The way I've described the story is somewhat problematic. I'll tell you why it's problematic. Not in the same section, but the same Talmud tells us that when the Jews left Egypt, now I'm going to say that again, every adult left with 90, that's 90, donkeys carrying Egyptian wealth. What did they need this for? Understand it. You know, if you're talking about a whole lot of destitute slaves who've just gotten out of Egypt, and now there's golden jewelry lying on the banks of the sea, you take it. But if you've already got 90 donkey loads of wealth, what do you need it for? What do you need it for? And not only that, what are you ever going to do with this stuff? The Jews are going into the desert. What are you going to do with all the gold and silver in the desert? And even if, as they believed at that stage, they were going straight into Israel, how much wealth does a person need? What's with these people? And again, they're counting the days. Remember, if you're counting the days, that means you counted that day also. That means that even that day, they were excited about going to Sinai. How could they possibly have been so greedy that they need that much more gold, silver, and jewelry that they're willing to delay their way to Mount Sinai when they don't even have anywhere to put all the stuff because they've already got 90. I mean, you try and manage 90 donkeys through a desert. They don't even have anywhere to put the stuff. What is going on in their heads? And you see, this is the thing. Whenever we read stories in the Torah, we tend by default to project ourselves into those stories. And if we don't project ourselves, we project other people we know, usually members of our own family. So we think, this is exactly my kids. Doesn't matter what you give them, it's never enough. They're never satisfied. Because that's what happens. Every mother at some point in her life has done this at least once. You come back and have what you believe to be a rational conversation with your child and you cannot understand why they don't follow it. I don't understand. Today, I took you in the morning to your soccer practice. Then on the way home, I bought you a chiller because you were whining about a chiller. Then you came home, you insisted you have to play PlayStation for 3 hours and you can't clean your room. I let you play PlayStation for 3 hours. Then you wanted to go swimming. I took you to swim. Blah, 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 blah. And this is how you treat me. Right? Every mother at some point has had that conversation. So we project ourselves into the story and we say, Moshe is the mother, and those are my kids. It's exactly what happens. Nothing you give them is ever enough. But the truth is that the Torah wants us to learn how to see every story in a far more profound way than what is natural for us. So I want to look at this from a more profound way. Why did the Jews land up with 90 donkeys laden with wealth when they left Egypt? Let me put this into context. God forbid, if anyone we know, God forbid, had been wrongly accused of a crime and locked away. And then eventually they were proven to be innocent. I don't know if you saw recently, there was that woman in the States who was released after, I think, 38 years, wrongly accused of murder. She never met her daughter. A ridiculous story like that. The simcha, the joy. So our head automatically goes to, whoa, the government needs to compensate them. Their head goes to the thrill of freedom. Maybe later, they'll start to think about the fact that they should sue for compensation. But initially, the thrill of freedom is so intoxicating, you don't think of anything else. So here's a Jewish nation that's been enslaved for 210 years. I guarantee you their first thought is not how much money can we take. It's how far can we get from these people. How did they land up with 90? 90. Not that like a few things in their pockets. Like, rifle somebody's drawers and take their cash. 90 donkeys of wealth. How'd that happen? How'd that happen? What kind of psychology is this? Hey guys, you're free. Hang on a second. Just got to load up the donkeys. It's like, what's going on?
Maybe they were scared.
Scared of what?
Like of not making it on the other side or...
Okay, I hear that. I hear that there's definitely...
Hand the donkeys over.
Well, that's part of the interesting story is that the Torah does tell us the Egyptians were actually quite compliant and they helped them with the wealth and whatever.
Trying to slow them down.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Again, if your objective is get as far away from these people, you don't need, it's bad enough traveling with kids. You don't need 90 buckies of stuff that has to travel. Have you ever traveled in convoy? It's the slowest way to travel.
Maybe there's some spiritual thing about having nothing, and maybe they felt that they were nothing.
Okay,
And
so that I hear that.
It's a symbolic thing, but taking the wealth of their oppressors maybe made them uplifted to some other level that they felt was needed in order to get to where they were going.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I think that's a very powerful possibility that when a person's been stripped down of everything in their life for generations, they need to sort of feel their place in society again with having, some assets.
And was that wealth all physical wealth? Like if you take someone who
Good
comes
question
out
too.
of the Holocaust, they were stripped of their everything, their identity, their humanity, their everything. So maybe it's wealth in that, getting back.
reclaiming
Becoming human.
humanity.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's really valid, and all of these things have merit, and all of these things can really spawn a whole conversation of their own. What's relevant for our conversation is that we're missing the main reason why they took all of this wealth, and that is because the Torah portion we just read this past Shabbos, Hashem tells them they have to. Hashem says to them, not only must they take wealth, but the wording that he uses is, you have to clean out Egypt. So they now have a direct instruction from Hashem how to behave in that situation. They don't have to necessarily understand it. In fact, when you're doing something because Hashem said so, it may not make sense. So logically, I don't need so much wealth. But Hashem said, I got to do it. So they're in a headspace that says, what Hashem expects of me right now is to clean out Egypt. That is the single most important thing I need to do right now. When they leave with their 90 donkey loads, they're pretty convinced they've done what they had to do. It doesn't get better than this. And then they arrive at the sea and Hashem drowns the Egyptians. Hashem could have also drowned all their wealth, but he doesn't. He causes all this wealth to wash up on the shore. So in their mind, they're like, oh, we still have this mitzvah to do. We still have this way of serving God that we haven't completed. Clearly, because look, it's all around us. There's all this gold and silver and diamonds and whatever. It's all around us. We don't know what we'll ever do with this stuff. But we know that that's what Hashem expects of us. Right now, he expects of us to clear out Egypt. So we're absolutely dedicated to that cause. And Moshe has to come to them and say, time's up, fellas. Meaning to say, if you get too caught up in one way of serving Hashem, and you don't have the ability to pivot when there's a new way to serve Hashem, then you get stuck. In other words, what Moshe is telling them is, it is possible for a particular approach to be absolutely valid, and then at a different time, in different circumstances, to be completely irrelevant. And wisdom is knowing how to make that distinction. Wisdom is knowing when something has passed its sell-by date and when I have to learn a completely different method of how to behave. So to me, that's our first principle, that's our first lesson to dealing with a rapidly changing world. Before we get down into the details of what we should do and how we should do it and who's the expert and where do we find access to their wisdom, the first thing that we have to do is this major internal work of acceptance that everything I believed to be correct and was valid in a particular scenario may no longer be valid. Now that's a very dangerous place to be, because that means I actually don't know where I stand. It reminds me of the story when I was in yeshiva in Israel, in Kfar Chabad. So the biggest personality in the yeshiva at that time was Reb Mendel Futerfas, who was this incredible chassid, a person who had fought against the Soviet system, had landed up in prison, was severely beaten over the period that he was in prison, and he came out as this incredible human being. So he once told me, it was a group of us, it was a small group of us sitting, and he told us this story, that when he was in Siberia, which as you can imagine is, most people didn't survive Siberia, not necessarily because of exposure, but because they went crazy. Imagine, we don't understand how large the area known as Siberia is. It's like half the African continent. And people, there was no way out. They didn't even need fences. There's no way out. People will just die of exposure or be killed by wild animals, who knows what. People went crazy. So everybody would do different things to try and retain their sanity while they were in Siberia, never knowing how long that they were going to be there. So Reb Mendel he was fortunate, he was a very learned man, so he used to review his learning. That's what kept him sane. There was a guy there who had been a circus performer. And the way he kept himself sane is he used to walk the tightrope. That's what he used to do, to keep himself sane. And every time he put up his tightrope, everybody would come and watch and they'd applaud and whatever. So Reb Mendel once asked this guy, he says, what's your secret? What's your secret? Because not everybody can walk a tightrope and most people are going to fall. What's your secret? So the fellow said to Reb Mendel, he said, "You look like a smart man. You tell me what you think and I'll tell you if you're right." So Reb Mendel said, "I think that the secret is you are absolutely fixated on the other side of the tightrope. So as long as you have your goal clearly in your sights, then you'll be fine." So he said, "You're right." He says, "The minute you look to either side, you lose that sense of where you are and your bearings, and then you fall." So the tightrope walker says to Reb Mendel, he says, "Seeing as you're a smart person, you work this out, what do you think is the most dangerous time during the act?" So the most dangerous time is where you get to the other side. Because now you've got to pivot. Because you've got to get back. The ladder's on this side. So you've got to pivot. And in that time that you're turning, you can't see your goal. It's not possible. Even though it's for a fraction of a second. But that's the time you're most likely to fall because you've lost sense of where you have to go. If you are a parent living in 2023, you are living that pivot. Now, what's happening to us is that the world around us is changing. We have no control over that. But for safety, our natural reaction is to clutch back at what we had in the past because it helped us in the past, so we believe it's going to help us into the future. And while that is true fundamentally, because there are certain axiomatic realities, certain principles of life that never change no matter what's going on in the world, how we approach them and how we apply them is where the pivot happens. So we don't change our fundamental principles. When the Jews have to leave the side of the sea and head towards Sinai, their fundamental principles remain the same. I was at the sea because I was doing what Hashem wanted. Now I had to be reminded what Hashem wants from me right now is to go somewhere else. So the foundational principle remains the same. I'm guided by the same values. I'm guided by the same dedication. That doesn't mean I have to behave in the same way I always behaved. Wisdom is to know how to apply ancient, eternal principles in innovative and relevant ways. So it doesn't give us an answer yet. It doesn't tell us do these things, but it gives us a tremendous amount of food for thought. Because the irony of life is that the people who adapt modern principles expire because those principles expire. The people who are able to keep eternal principles but are modern in their thinking and approach always become the bright lights of a society. So, as an example, when Moshe turns to Hashem at the beginning of his career and he says, "I cannot talk," what he's really saying is, I cannot talk to those people. I don't relate to those people. Moshe is such an elevated soul. He's in such an elevated state of being at any given time. I don't know how to talk to people who complain about every little thing. I don't know how to talk to them. And Hashem's response to him is, and who made people talk in the first place? In other words, the principle of being able to communicate what needs to be communicated, that's my gift. Your responsibility is to be committed to find the way. My gift is to help you find it. So I really feel, as parents living in this rapidly changing world, our first principle that we have to learn is to say the ancient values of Judaism haven't changed. How we relay them and how we make them relevant to our kids, that is our challenge. We are going to feel, I don't have the vocabulary, I don't have the way to express this, and then we have to trust, but Hashem assists those who do the right thing or want to do the right thing to be able to succeed. So if we think we're going to be the Chachamim, we're finished. If we're humble enough to realize we need Hashem's help, we're on our path towards the right direction. Okay, so next time we'll have to talk about maybe something we could actually do. But I just think principally, the value of understanding that there is it's appropriate to pivot is really important for us. Okay, so that's where we're going to pause for today. Obviously, you may have some questions or comments.